and welcome to Dialogue. The Western media has enjoyed a powerful influence on global public opinions for nearly a century, but some have criticized the Western media for not trying harder to better report stories from non-Western countries and even having biases against such countries. Is there a Western media bias towards non-Western countries? Is there a Western media war against countries like China? And as the rest of the world rises, should the West prepare for a long overdue reckoning? To help us answer these questions, I'm glad to talk with Chandran Nair, founder and CEO of the Global Institute for Tomorrow. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to Dialogue. Mr. Chandran Nair, you published an article earlier this year, actually, in the South China Morning Post, based in Hong Kong, with the title, Western media must reflect on the year of shameful bias in China, Qatar, Ukraine war coverage. Tell us your observation of this, what you see as biases, or biased coverage of these topics.
Well, firstly, thank you for having me on the show. And that's a question which could take an hour of elaboration, but I'll keep it short. There's so many examples, but 2-3 examples that triggered me writing that article, of course, started with the coverage of the World Cup in Qatar and the relentless efforts to undermine the World Cup, the solidarity that brings nations together, and to talk about the country. Clearly, no country is perfect, and Qatar has its sorts of issues, but it's a pattern. And you will remember how during the Beijing Olympics, the same thing happened. So the World Cup was one. The other was clearly the way the unfortunate and tragic war in Ukraine was being covered by the Western media as well. Rather than allowing a global audience to understand the history and the complexities, it was all very one-sided, that there's the bad guys and the good guys. We are on the side of the good guys, as if the rest of the world is ignorant to history. And I was particularly taken by the way that the Western media was very quick to jump to accusations about war crimes being committed. And if that's the case, then why weren't same accusations being leveled against the Americans in Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. So those are two very clear examples. Cluster bombs, the use of cluster bombs, apparently by the Russians and the Ukrainians, and now we have the Americans sending cluster bombs. No coverage at all about all of those. And then, of course, the other thing was to do with the China bashing, which from Xinjiang issues, so ridiculous accusations of genocide, right through to how the coverage of COVID. So it was becoming so obvious that people like me who read the Western media, so it's not like I'm getting these persuasions and being persuaded to think differently by reading, China Daily only, or, Russian media, who read the Western media, looking for informed observations and insights, are being turned off by an insult to our intelligence with a constant sort of negative narratives that are simply ideological based. So those are the examples I would cite.
Mm-hmm. Of course, for our viewers' sake, Western media is typically defined as media which comes from North America, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand, countries which share a somewhat common heritage culturally and also have strong political ties. People would say because of the similarity in their culture, in their politics, so people would question whether those biases, quote unquote, is simply, different perspectives, or are they truly biases? What's your response?
Well, it's interesting you do mention that what's essentially the mainstream Western media, which is the Anglosphere, and the countries you mentioned, including Canada. I would include Canada, and that are all white settler communities emanating out of the UK. And you will know from a geopolitical lens, they formed a security alliance called the Five Eyes. So these are politically aligned. So it's very difficult to talk about the way they cover the world news, given that these are settler communities with very dark histories, who are now trying to promote a worldview of purer than thou, that they understand the world and how it should work. So it's I don't think it's a question of whether they have, we can attribute it to cultural or political perspectives. Cultural and political perspectives are born out of our biases. And our biases are essentially something that, reflects a prejudice. It's typically an unfair treatment of an issue or a people. Whereas, a perspective is a point of view. You're entitled to your point of view, but if you're a global media and you credit yourself with being fair, then you can't display this level of bias and prejudice against other cultures, other forms of governments, etc. So I think these biases are a reflection of history, the way history is absorbed. And sadly, I would say I've come to the conclusion that many of the Western media, and particularly in the Anglosphere, do not recognize maybe or come to terms with the fact that after 400 years of dominance, they have rather sort of strange views about other nations. They have an exceptionalism about their culture, the superiority of their ways. And at this point in history, are finding it difficult to come to terms with a leveling out with the rise of other nations like China, etc. So it's not simply a perspective which everyone's entitled to, but a sustained bias reflecting views that are based on exceptionalism is not something that the world should tolerate or is actually anyone interested in, at least observers who are looking for, new perspectives.
Let's say when we talk about this, such biases, such a practice of biases, what do you see as the reason for such practices?
Well, the reason is pretty clear. I mean, I have said earlier, I've been reading the Western media. I was brought up on the Western media. I've read so that was my way to understand the world. We were all subject to that sort of colonization of the mind. That's all we knew. I came from a British colony, all of that. So, and we respected them. But over the years, I like to think I'm fairly observant and slightly intelligent. And I began to see, well, China can't be all wrong. How can this, ancient civilization be all so bad and wrong? And then I'm, of course, living in Hong Kong. I've been traveling to China for 30 years. I've seen the most incredible human transformation. I don't think China is perfect. I have written about this in the China Daily and international media. But China's achievements cannot be dismissed. And yet there's this constant dismissal of China. And so I've come to the conclusion that the root cause of this is the loss of power. And that is essentially now affecting the way the media industry works too. Because let's understand that much of the global media, the Western media, has its roots in colonization, the protection of privilege, the promotion of ideology, going back to economic ideas from 80 to 100 years, and of course the promotion of Western lifestyles, because if you get everyone else to embrace Western civilization, then they begin to see you as superior, they embrace all your goods and services, etc. That is beginning to change. And the Western media, which for a while thought it was a liberal business model that promoted liberal ideas, or at least could pretend to, now sees that very structure being eroded by the rise of others who have different ideas. And therefore they have, as I say, become almost allies of whichever government is in charge, which even if they oppose nationally, they will support internationally, because the international changing of the rules of the game also has an impact on them as a journalist. A Western journalist is no more regarded as essentially a beacon of fairness and truth, nor welcome, because there are many other outlets from which we can get news and information. And people like me have now gone to many other sources because I'm tired of listening to untruths and biases.
Mm-hmm. Well, speak of the rules of governance, there's a term often mentioned in the Western press and also by Western politicians, that's rules-based international order. Of course, there's no clear definition, except for that is US-led or the Western-led global community. Somehow there is legitimacy for them to dictate world affairs. And of course, the rest of the world, with their own development and waking up somewhat, at least find that there's a problem with that kind of claim or practice.
Yeah, I mean, no one would deny that we need rules. Now, we all would agree that a free-for-all in which any country can do anything in a globalized world will not be the best formula. So we do need rules. What is now being argued is this abstract notion of rules-based world order, which is essentially a Western rules-based order, in which others apparently cannot have an equal say. And so that is being played out, sadly, even by the Western media and by journalists who should know better, who write about globalization and written about it for 20, 30 years, and economists, as apparently as the only rule. I think what the rest of the world is saying, we want rules too, but we want these rules to be proportionate to our say in the world, our presence in the world, and our numbers as well. So it's not about against rules, it's about new rules. And these include, for instance, rules that do not allow the Americans and the Europeans to weaponize the grand bargain of the US dollar as the reserve currency of the world. So there are many other trade rules, etc. So yeah, that's one of the great reckonings that is taking place, that the rules base has to be a rules on which the majority of the world sign up, not in which a few say these are the rules and you all will abide by those rules. This will be the great challenge of our times, and it's already taking place. So rules by all, rules are all needed, but we need rules in which the majority also feel that they can partake and have a say.
Yeah, of course, related to that, we see, for example, BRICS countries and the rest of the developing countries are becoming more aware of their, let's say, equality issue, or their voice being fairly represented in global governance. And of course, one of the major countries, among the developing countries is China. And in one article, you mentioned, a key feature of mainstream Western media today is the relentless China bashing. And of course, we are not strange to the, like daily coverage of China in almost a completely negative light. Everything about China is toxic right now, in particular in the US. So what's your view of that change? Previously, of course, China-US, in the US policy toward China is engagement. And right now, is people would say there's a containment, there's a new Cold War against China. And interestingly, you see the views of the Americans are turning negative toward China.
Oh, yes. I mean, the negativity towards China, I mean, as someone who's lived in Hong Kong for over 25 years, I started to sniff during the Beijing Olympics. I saw the Olympics as an opportunity for the world to welcome China, but it became one in which China was being heavily criticized. And so the bashing then just, went off the radar in the last 6 years. And the motivation for me is very simple. At one level, it's rooted in the exceptionalism of the American view that we are the only ones that can be number one. That exceptionalism, in my view, is also rooted in racism, that others cannot be at the same table with us. The whole, concept of the yellow peril and all of these things, and xenophobia. But the root cause of all forms of racism and this sort of exceptionalism, as I speak about in my book on dismantling global white privilege, is the retention of economic power. Colonization was about extracting wealth, dominating wealth, and having a hegemony in terms of economic power. Today, the troops are off the ground, but other instruments of power, including the rules of globalization and terms such as the rules-based order, are used to dominate others. And so that's why, as China rises and, and poses a threat in terms of economic power, etc., political influence around the world, the Western media and the governments have come together to relentlessly bash China. The rest of the world do not see China, simply as a saint, or we are on the Chinese side, or we're anti-American, etc. We just want to see how the two biggest powers will work together and create a more peaceful world in which the others can essentially also benefit from that cooperation. But the rest of the world are not fools, particularly all of us who've been colonized. We know where the root source of this resentment in the West towards the rise of China. And at the moment it's China, but 10 years from now, it might be India. As India rises and becomes more powerful, and India exerts its influence, who knows? It will be India for sure. And so, but we need to understand what it is. It's the inability to share power in the West, and that insecurity is driving both media and Western politicians to behave in the way that they are. I'll finish up by saying that I think it's a very unfortunate own goal. It's an own goal of relentlessly demonizing other nations, which has got the rest of the world to wonder how weak and insecure is the West, because other people are not fools. They can see through this.
Mr. Chandra, if you look at the U.S. media coverage of China, for example, it's basically about Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Taiwan, Tibet, pollution, human rights, everything negative. But you look at the Chinese media coverage, or I would say, coverage of the West from the developing world, is rather, more objective, matter based on the matter. You cover what's going on, what's happening. There's little coverage, probably not that much aggressive coverage of, for example, mass shootings, homelessness in the U.S., or private imprisons for profit, for example, practices that would be, surprising or shocking to the rest of the world. So, in this part, what do you see, the media from the developing world, including, the major developing countries, what they should do in terms of probably providing a different view, a balancing view, or a true variety of views in terms of this, the world we are in today?
A very good question, and I think that shows the difference in culture and therefore the notion of the media. In other parts of the world, I don't think we should follow the sort of Western tradition of journalism and media, which is based on essentially sensationalism and the heroics of journalists to speak truth to power. I think media in the 21st century needs to be a lot more sophisticated than that. And journalists should not be superheroes, apparently, exposing all the failings of everything. But of course, of governments, etc. Of course, they should objectively identify issues. So therein lies a difference, and it's partly history as well as political systems, etc. As you say, almost everything reported in the U.S. about China is apparently it's a terrible place. It's hell on earth. That you should not go there. That the moment you step into China and you eat something, you might be poisoned. If only they knew. So, but then in Asia, people don't represent the United States or Europe in that way. I've traveled extensively in Europe. There's a lot of things I could say that are terrible about the United States, but we're not obsessed with that. We are interested in what are the good things that we can learn from, and hoping that they will solve their problems. The systemic racism in Europe and in the USA, and all of those things, the grand scale sort of fraudulent financial systems. But we're not focused on that. We're focused on what are the good things there. It's for them to sort out their own problems. I mean, we could write a whole lot of stuff about the war machine, that is NATO, etc. So I think what we need to do in this part of the world is create the media of the 21st century, that in the future, when people look for fair media coverage, they will come to media from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, because we are not rooted in ideological obsessions and promoting our exceptionalism, and we have nothing to hide, though we will have certain things that we want to hide. But the journalism and the way the media functions will be very different. If I may add, you have asked me questions to essentially justify my critique of Western media, and that's a good way to have a conversation, rather than say, you're so right, Chandran, please tell me how bad they are. And that's not what you did. You asked me to defend my critique. I'm a great admirer of many things in the West, including parts of the Western media. But in the last 5, 10 years, I think it's fallen into a trap. And I think that's what journalism should be. And we have an opportunity in the non-Western world to create a new, more responsible form of journalism that is more observant, scholarly, and objective.
Mm-hmm. But speak of that, obviously there's a need of a further development of the media industry, let's say, for the lack of words, in the developing world, to at least to balance, if not, because right now we see there's a dominance of Western media. They are so powerful in terms of the narratives, in terms of the perception, and also their opinions are being widely shared around the world. At least for the developing world, they needed to have a chance to have their voice being heard, right?
Absolutely. This is going to be a big struggle because it's all about money. The large media companies of the West have a 50-year lead on all of the other parts of the world, and they've invested heavily. They have government support, etc. And most importantly, they have a captive audience even in the developing world. It's what colonialism does to you. So if you're brought up in a British colony in Africa, whether in Kenya, India, Malaysia, or Singapore, you think BBC is part of the world infrastructure. And you believe that whatever BBC says must be correct. That is changing. That is changing. But it will take time. So what's happening now, I think, in the rest of the world is smaller media groups are beginning to mushroom. And these are providing insights for people who might watch one of the international media things and think, that's not quite correct. I saw this thing about Iran from an Iran source that is very different because, we have social media, etc. So I think the new media landscape will not be the big giants. It will be a multitude, and the giants will fade away because, unfortunately, they're shooting themselves in the foot by being so duplicitous and not giving us all a fair understanding of the access to the information they had. If they had, many of us will be watching it because they have the access, they have the money, but people will not watch them anymore. So I think the last point I'd make here is, in this part of the world, in Africa, etc., we need to invest in media groups. I've been calling for this for 10 years.
You mentioned a very important phenomenon here. The people, elites from developing world sometimes, because you consume the Western media and you think alike and you follow their thinking. Like when the US said China is bad, the Brazilians would say, yes, China is bad.
Yes.
That's a problem.
And I saw this among all my friends. And this is why I observed this for 10 years. And that's why I started writing about it. Because I said, have you been to China? No. I said, China is not perfect, but by God, it's not what they say. Because I've been going all around China. Yeah, I've been from, from Gansu province to Shanghai to everywhere. And so the elites in our area are all basically intellectually captured. And the other thing that's happening, interestingly, you might be interested, which, there's very strong censorship. 10 years ago, I used to write for some of the leading newspapers in the world. Today, very difficult.
So it's becoming... Go ahead. It's becoming more zero-sum. Like either you are on China's side or you are on our side.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You're either on my side or on your side. So I submit. I know some of these editors of the most powerful newspapers, and they will always pass. And I'm not doing a bashing of the U.S. I'm just giving a balanced view from Asia because there's so few views from Asia that articulate this. They don't want it. If I say anything good about China, Iran, Russia, then I cannot be published. But surely they must know that as a global media, there must be people who can provide perspectives that allow their readers to understand that no country can be all bad.
Yeah, different. Right, different perspectives.
Yeah, different perspective. But today it's almost impossible to get published in that way. Once you're known to be a bit more balanced and nuanced. I wrote a piece, you'll be interested, on Huawei.
Yes.
3 months ago. Really interesting story of business, governance systems, and the geopolitics. No one that I know in the international media, people I know, editor, would publish it. One even apologized to me and said, Chandran, this piece is so good, but I can't publish it.
Why?
Because I will get so much pressure from my top and from my stakeholders.
Because it's a positive story about Huawei, or?
Yes, it's a positive story, but I was not taking ideological. I was just talking about the business model, the origins of Huawei, Mr. Ren's history, the shareholding structure, and all of that, which is a great business story, which Harvard Business Review should, in fact, publish, and then bringing it into the current context of the role of technology for society, because Huawei is doing some amazing things. Most people in the world don't know. But that was immediately seen as, we can't say it because you're seen to be promoting Huawei. But if I wrote something like this about, Facebook or about some US tech company, they'd all publish it.
With that, we come to the end for today's show. Many thanks to our guest, Mr. Chandran Nair. You can also find us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.